get to the enzyme kinetics. This subject is very it is annoying to me, but we have to just get through it. So let's go. We have v, which is the speed of the reaction, I believe, and we have v max, which is the maximum speed of the reaction that you can get. We have the substrate concentration. We have Km, which is the Michaelis constant, Mertens Michaelis, something like that. And it is basically the concentration of the substrates at half of the Vmax. So half of the Vmax we have here, which is here the reaction velocity, the speed of the reaction, and the Km represents the substrate concentration at which the Vmax is half. Amazing. So the reaction velocity equation is Vmax times the substrate concentration over Km plus the substrate concentration. How did they come up with this equation? God knows. We can't actually ask that. It's too deep. These are usually theoretical, mathematical equations and proofing that is behind why we see this equation. So y is the reaction velocity equation as, what did we have? Vmax times the substrate concentration over Km plus the substrate concentration. Cool. Forget about the question mark. So Vmax is what velocity at which an enzyme can possibly convert substrate. It is the maximum velocity. So we are talking about speed here. And speed in physics terms is distance over time, right? So the more speed you have, it means that you are covering more distance over time. And increasing the substrate concentration does not increase Vmax, but it increases the amount of enzyme does. What? That sentence is not correct. So when you increase the substrate concentration, you do not increase the Vmax. This is Vmax, right? You cannot increase Vmax. Vmax cannot be increased because, why do you think so? Because each enzyme has a certain limitation. Vmax is a limit. You cannot go past the limit. Just like your car, it cannot go past 200 miles an hour, right? The engine busts off, the enzyme goes crazy, the enzyme shuts down, or it bursts out, right? but increasing the amount of enzyme does. So you can increase Vmax by increasing the amount of the enzymes, because the more enzymes you have, the more Vmax you have, because it's like adding engines to your car. Instead of having a V2, you can have a V6. Instead of having a V6, you can have a double V6. You can have V12. You can even have W16. I think that's what Bugatti is. So, yes. We have here the Against equation, and we have V, which is the velocity at which an enzyme is actively converting substrate. So V is about the enzyme itself. So it's the speed at which the enzyme is actively converting the substrate into what? Into the product, right? And we have the Km, which is the Michaelis constant. And it is the concentration of substrate you need for your reaction to go half of the Vmax. Think of it as how much gas you need to add for your car to go half of its maximum speed. This is used as a proxy for enzyme affinity. So the whole point of Km is to describe the affinity of the enzyme to that substrate. You want to see how attracted, for example, insulin is to glucose, right? The more affinity it has, the lower the Km. What does lower Km mean? This is the amount of Km. It is the substrate concentration at Vmax half, right? Now, if you wanted a higher affinity, you would reach Vmax faster. So you would achieve it in lesser substrate concentration. So the less substrate concentration means that you just needed less substrate concentration to reach half of the Vmax. It means that the enzyme is very affectionate. The affinity of the enzyme is very high. It wants to bind to the substrate very quickly. And the opposite, if the Km is here, it means it's slower. So the substrate concentration over time takes longer to attach to the enzyme. So the Km is higher, which means the affinity is low. So it takes a lot of substrate to reach half of Vmax. Again, Km represents enzyme affinity. You have the concentration of substrate, which is obvious. You have the transition states. Now we're talking about what basically enzymes do. So on the y-axis, we have the energy, and on the x-axis, we have the reaction coordinate. Which one is the variable dependent, and which one is the independent variable? Is x-axis the dependent or independent variable? In the context of a graph or chart, the x-axis typically represents independent variable. The independent variable, IV, is the one that is manipulated or controlled by the experimenter. For example, if you're studying the effect of different temperatures on plant growth, the temperature which you can control and change would be plotted on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the dependent variable, such as the plant's growth. which changes as a result of the variations in temperature. So the dependent variable depends on the independent variable, and the independent variable, you can change it. So here you can change the reaction coordinates, whatever that is, and the energy is dependent on the reaction coordinates. So how the reaction proceeds with or without the enzyme, the energy depends on that. So with enzyme, you are lowering the energy of the transition state, which is why it takes less time for the reaction to go through. So the activation energy of the enzyme with enzyme is like this, and the activation energy without the enzyme is too high. And the overall energy released during reaction is this, because this is an exothermic reaction. Due to the fact that reactants have higher energy, are in higher energy state than the products, CO2 and H2O are more stable, and they are in a lower energy state than reactants here. Then I believe this is glucose and oxygen. So the transition state is the peak of an energy curve, the highest potential energy possible in a reaction. And this must be overcome for a reaction to proceed forward. Cool? Cool. The kinetics deals with how quickly the reaction proceeds. So kinetics is basically about the speed of the reaction. And if we're looking at if we're looking at the reaction A towards B, equilibrium is the concentration values of A and B when the reaction levels out, and there is no net change in values. Kinetics is how quickly the conversion from A to B occurs. So how fast you convert A to B is about kinetics. Equilibrium is about the concentration of A and B when the reaction levels out and there is no net change in values. So when there's no net change, the net change equals to 0. That is when the reaction is in equilibrium. I believe there is also the concept of equilibrium in forces, as to say that the net forces on an object is 0. It is at equilibrium. It doesn't mean that there are no forces on the object, but it means that the net forces balance out. The equilibrium of a reaction deals with the concentration of the reactant in product, at which there is no net change in the amount of reactants in products. So when it's all balanced out, there is no reactant turning into product, or vice versa. That is equilibrium state. In layman's terms, a reaction will run until it reaches a point where the amount of substrate and amount of product no longer change. This is called the equilibrium. The activation energy is required to get the reactants over the hump of the transition curve, which allows the reaction to proceed to the products. Right? So it gets the reactants over the hump of the transition curve, which allows the reaction to proceed to the products. The enzyme has the greatest energetic impact on the transition state. So the greatest impact on the transition state is from the enzyme. The transition state is the peak of an energy curve which must be overcome. The Michaelis-Menten equation, that's what we were talking about. and it is that V equals, so this whole equation is called the Michaelis-Menten equation, which is V equals Vmax times the substrate concentration over Km plus substrate concentration. V equals velocity at which an enzyme is actively converting substrate. We went over this. So Vmax is the maximum velocity at which an enzyme can Vmax is the maximum velocity at which an enzyme can convert substrate, right? Increasing the substrate concentration does not increase Vmax, so you cannot, but increasing the enzyme does, right? And substrate concentration is with S, and Km is the concentration of substrate at half of the Vmax. And think of it, and the purpose of Km is the enzyme affinity. So lower Km, it has a reverse relationship with enzyme affinity. So the higher Km means that there's lower affinity because you need less substrate for the enzyme to bind to the substrate. Enzymes act as catalysts to impact the rate of the reaction. The enzymes do not impact the equilibrium. This will be on your test. It's always on the test. Enzymes do not impact the equilibrium. So the balance, equilibrium of a reaction is not affected by enzymes. Now, this is the tricky part. So we have 3 different types of inhibitors. And inhibitors are, I like to call this mnemonic as cunt, I believe. But I know it's very vulgar, but cunt can give you the competitive, uncompetitive, and non-competitive and you should go in this order. So where do they bind? So where does the inhibitor bind? See the inhibitor as so the competitive one is a direct competitor of the enzyme. So it must attach to the enzyme, right? Because it is directly competing with the enzyme. Now, the uncompetitive inhibitor is, so the hard part is about the uncompetitive and the non-competitive. So these two, how do you make sense between on and non? What is the difference between on and non? We will see. So the effect on Km. So when you have this competitive inhibitor that competes with the enzyme and it binds to the active side of the enzyme, it is kind of acting like a substrate, right? So when this is sitting on the active side of the enzyme, then the effect on the Km would be, so the Km, so you need more of the substrate to attach to the enzymes available because they need to compete with the competitive inhibitor, right? So therefore, the Km should be decreasing, but it is increasing. Why? Well, the increase in Km means that the affinity of the enzyme is lower, right? So there's less affinity, which totally So the enzyme has less affinity for the substrate. Now that makes sense because when you have more competitive enzymes competing with the substrate and the enzyme and directly sitting on the active side of the enzyme, then of course the enzyme has less affinity for the substrates because the active sites are already full. Why does it need more substrates? So it doesn't like more substrates. So therefore, because it has less affinity for um, for the enzyme, then for the substrate, there's no less affinity between the substrate and the enzyme. Then there's less spots available, and the Km increases. Now the effect on the Vmax. So Vmax is related to the total amount of enzymes. So if you are increasing the enzymes, then the Vmax increases. If there's less enzymes in total, you have lower Vmax. And here we should note that the Vmax doesn't change. Now, why is that the case? Is the number of enzymes increasing? No. Is the number of enzymes decreasing? No. Then the Vmax should be stable. We also have this file here for the enzymes. It might be actually good to go in parallel with this file here. So Vmax is the maximum rate of the reaction, and Km is the amount of substrate needed for the enzyme to work half as fast. I will continue with this, but for now, that's where we left off. You see here that the competitive inhibitor does not affect the Vmax, but increases the Km. How does it do so? Is it explained here? Yeah, so these are the main differences. Vmax connects the active, binds to the active side and prevents the substrate from binding. And in non-competitive, the inhibitor binds only to the enzyme substrate complex. So the substrate sits here, and the uncompetitive inhibitor sits on the side. And the non-competitive binds at the allosteric side, away from the active side. It does not prevent the substrate from binding to the active side. Now, if that is the non-competitive inhibitor, then why is it here that non-competitive inhibitor attaches to both the enzyme and the enzyme substrate complex? Is the allosteric side known as both the enzyme and the enzyme substrate complex? We'll figure out. But our main question here is, why does Vmax not change in competitive inhibitor with competitive inhibitor? And likewise, like same for Km and Vmax. For why does Km not change for non-competitive inhibitor? So for now, I'll get back to this very soon. Peace for now.